The moment I saw her reaching for my parrot with a net like some rogue animal control officer, I knew something was terribly wrong. And it wasn't just Karen's twisted sense of authority, it was how far she was willing to go to prove a point. If you've ever had a neighbor like this, one who acts like they run the whole neighborhood and hides behind made-up rules, you're going to want to hear this story all the way through because what she did next will absolutely blow your mind. Follow Sham Stories for more shocking HOA tales that expose the truth behind the power-hungry faces in your community. It all began on a quiet Wednesday morning in early spring, the kind of peaceful morning when Jasper, my African gray parrot, loved to perch on the wooden stand just outside our porch, softly chirping greetings to the passers-by as he soaked up the sunlight. Jasper wasn't just a bird, he was family, smarter than most pets, with a vocabulary that sometimes startled people into believing he was more human than feathered. Everyone on our block adored him well. Everyone except Karen. Karen had always been a thorn in the side of our neighborhood, self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, clipboard in hand, and an aggressive tone in every conversation. She patrolled like a warden instead of a neighbor. Her dislike for Jasper had been passive-aggressive for months. Comments like, "Your bird sure has a loud mouth," or "Isn't there a limit on animals?" But no one took her seriously, till that day. I just stepped back into the house to grab a glass of orange juice when I heard Jasper's frantic squawking pierce the calm. I rushed out to find Karen creeping up to his perch, net in hand, and a small cage at her feet. Jasper flapped his wings and shrieked, terrified. "What are you doing?" running across the yard. Karen spun around, completely unbothered by how insane she looked. "This animal is a nuisance. I've had complaints. He violates HOA noise policy," she snapped. "Out." I demanded she step away from my property, but she stood her ground, arguing that Jasper was disruptive and should be removed. I reminded her that there were no such rules in the HOA documents about parrots or pet noise, unless it was excessive, which Jasper's wasn't. She scoffed and stormed off, threatening to handle it herself. The next day I found an unsigned letter taped to my door saying I had 72 hours to remove Jasper or face escalating fines. I emailed the HOA board president, Mr. Halverson, who confirmed there had been no such complaints filed and that Karen wasn't authorized to issue any formal notices. That afternoon, I reviewed the doorbell footage and saw Karen walking up, taping the letter herself. I saved the clip and forwarded it to the board, but the real blow came the following weekend. I returned from the grocery store to find my side. Gate unlocked, Jasper's perch knocked over, and no sign of him in the yard. Panicked, running around calling his name, until I finally heard him squawk from high above. He had flown into the pine tree across the street, scared out of his feathers. After nearly 2 hours, I coaxed him down with one of his favorite crackers and got him safely back inside. I pulled up the camera footage again, and there she was. Karen had entered my yard with gloves and a canvas sack, clearly trying to grab Jasper. It was the final straw. I printed the photos, compiled the video, and knew I had to act. Not just for Jasper, but for every resident on our block who had been bullied, threatened, or manipulated by Karen's unchecked power. What she didn't realize was I had the truth, the law, and an entire neighborhood behind me, and we were just getting started. The following morning, I started making copies of everything, screenshots of the video, the HOA email exchange with Mr. Halverson, and even a printout of the HOA's official bylaws highlighting the complete absence of any rule related to owning birds or pet noise. I wasn't just preparing for a complaint, I was preparing for war. I slid everything into a folder and began walking house to house, politely asking neighbors if they'd experienced similar issues with Karen. Some hesitated at first, unsure if they wanted to get involved, but once I showed them the footage of her trying to grab Jasper, their eyes widened with disbelief. One neighbor, Doris, a retired librarian in her 70s, said Karen once accused her of hosting unauthorized gatherings because her book club met twice a month. Another neighbor, Luis, a father of 3, said Karen threatened him over visible toys in his front yard. A third, Molly, said Karen routinely trespassed onto her property to measure grass height with a ruler. These stories weren't just Annoying, they painted a picture of someone who had been terrorizing the neighborhood under the guise of HOA enforcement for years. Fueled by this new information, I organized a small gathering at my house that Friday evening and invited everyone who had something to share. To my surprise, nearly 15 people showed up, each carrying their own stories, frustrations, and in some cases, physical evidence. It felt like we were forming a neighborhood alliance, finally realizing we didn't have to tolerate this alone. Mr. Halverson agreed to attend as well, quietly sitting at the back and taking notes. As the meeting went on, I noticed something. The fear that many had lived with began to fade. We were realizing that Karen's power wasn't official. It was borrowed, stolen, or simply faked. The group agreed we needed to formally request a review of her role in the HOA and submit a joint complaint. But while we were organizing behind the scenes, Karen wasn't staying quiet. That same weekend, she started a smear campaign against me. Flyers appeared taped to mailboxes claiming my parrot carried disease, that it attacked pets and children, and that I had violated state animal control laws. She even posted an edited video on the neighborhood app that cut my voice and such. A way it made it seem like I had admitted to breaking rules. The comments were divided. Some neighbors believed her, others didn't. I posted my full security footage in response, and thankfully, most people saw right through her tactics. But Karen wasn't done. On Monday, I received a visit from two officers from animal control. They had received an anonymous complaint and were required to follow up. I invited them in, showed them Jasper's clean habitat, his vet records, and of course the video footage of Karen trying to abduct him. They were shocked. One of them whispered, "Honestly, we've seen this kind of harassment before. Usually, it's someone with too much time on their hands." They left without citing anything, and even assured me that I had every right to keep Jasper on my property. That small win gave me confidence. The following night, I submitted the official complaint to the HOA board, along with supporting signatures from over 24 neighbors. I made sure it included detailed documentation of Karen's attempted parrot theft, fake flyers, the harassment, and her history of made-up violations. It was a thorough package. Mr. Halverson emailed back the next morning thanking me for the information and stating that the board would hold an emergency hearing to review the situation. The meeting was scheduled for the next Thursday. In the days leading up to it, Karen doubled down. She began patrolling the streets even more aggressively, walking with her phone camera out like a cop on a beat. She yelled at a teenager for skateboarding. On the sidewalk, she took pictures of garbage cans left out past noon. She sent another fake HOA letter to the Petersons, warning them about their Christmas lights being too colorful. It was like she sensed her time was running out and was trying to assert dominance while she still could. Realize was that her reign of petty tyranny was about to collapse under the weight of her own delusions. By the time Thursday came, the community center was packed. More people showed up than any HOA meeting I'd seen in the last 5 years. Some were curious, others were furious, and a few just wanted to see what kind of drama would unfold. I brought my folder of evidence and sat near the front. Jasper safely at home in his cage with a camera streaming live footage to my phone just in case. Karen walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a navy blazer and a smug expression, pretending not to see me as she marched up to the microphone and requested to speak first. The board allowed it. She launched into a dramatic monologue about community standards, safety, and how she was simply trying to protect everyone from irresponsible pet owners. She showed a blurry printout of Jasper from months ago and tried to argue that I had broken multiple city codes. Then she claimed she had received hundreds of complaints about noise. Mr. Halverson calmly asked if she had any official records, warning letters, or audio evidence to support these claims. She hesitated, said she left the documents at home, and tried to move on. That's when he nodded to me. I stood up, opened my folder, and began handing out printed evidence to each board member, photos, email logs, screenshots of Karen on my property, copies of the unsigned notices, and the video still showing her mid-attempt with the net. Room was silent as they read. Then I played the unedited video on a projector, and the gasps were audible. Karen shrank in her chair, More neighbors stood up and began sharing their own run-ins with her stories of threats, fake violations, and bizarre behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The board members took notes, and within an hour, the entire meeting turned from a question of whether I had violated any rules to a question of how long. Karen had been abusing her fake power without oversight. Mr. Halverson thanked everyone and said the board would meet privately to discuss next steps. As people filtered out, many stopped to shake my hand. Others even apologized for not speaking out sooner. I felt vindicated, but I also knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. The next morning, I could sense a storm brewing before I even got out of bed. A few of my neighbors had texted me that Karen had been outside pacing up and down the sidewalks at sunrise, knocking on a few doors and holding what looked like some kind of handwritten petition. Didn't surprise me. Karen had never been one to admit defeat, and being publicly exposed at the HOA hearing must have stung her pride deeper than anyone realized. By the time I stepped outside to water the flowers, she was already walking toward my property with that familiar tight smile and a manila envelope under her arm. "Good morning," she said with a tone so brittle it could snap. "I've got something for you." She handed over the envelope and didn't wait for me to respond before she turned on her heel and walked away. Inside were about a dozen printed pages, each one a fake legal document claiming I had violated animal control ordinances, noise ordinances, and HOA landscaping guidelines, with red ink circling random phrases like daily disturbance and livestock regulation. She even included a cease and desist letter, laughably signed HOA Enforcement Chair, a title she'd given herself with no real authority. At the bottom was a threat. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in legal escalation. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it, but I also knew it was time to take things to a more official level. I gathered all her new documents, attached them to the original evidence packet I'd given the HOA, and then added a timeline that detailed each and every interaction I'd had with her over the past few months. I emailed it to Mr. Halverson and CC'd the full board. I didn't stop there. I also sent it to the actual county code enforcement department and the city's mediation office, just in case Karen tried to escalate things outside the HOA. Later that evening, Halverson called me personally. He sounded more irritated than I'd ever heard him. "She's making us all look like fools," he said bluntly. "She has no authority to send any of this. I'll be scheduling a vote to formally remove her from any HOA committee involvement." I thanked him, relieved but still wary. If the past few weeks had taught me anything, it was that Karen didn't quit until she was cornered in. Even then, she scratched her way out. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was changing in small but important ways. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA meetings were now talking, sharing their own experiences, and supporting one another. The Petersons put up new lawn decorations despite Karen's past warnings. The Masons let their kids rollerblade in the cul-de-sac again. It felt like a weight had lifted off the entire street, but Karen didn't disappear. The day before the HOA vote, I saw her standing at the edge of my yard staring up at Jasper's perch. He was happily chirping away, occasionally whistling the tune to Yankee Doodle, his favorite. I watched from the window as she stood there for a full 5 minutes before walking off. That evening I got a knock at the door. It was Officer Bennett, a local cop I'd seen patrolling the neighborhood a few times before. He had a calm demeanor, not the kind of guy to rattle easily, but even he looked slightly uncomfortable as he introduced himself. "Hey, just wanted to let you know we got another complaint claims of an exotic animal posing a safety threat." I sighed, already knowing where it came from. "You're welcome to come see Jasper," I said. He smiled. "I'd like to. I already know this is probably nothing, but we're required to follow up." I brought him inside and showed him Jasper's cage, the vet records, the permits, everything. Jasper greeted him with a perfectly clear "Hello, sir," which made the officer chuckled. "He talks better than some people I deal with," he said. We sat for a few minutes while I explained the situation, and he nodded along, clearly familiar with HOA nonsense. "We'll log this as unfounded," he said finally. "If she keeps using city resources for false complaints, she could get charged for it." That gave me a sense of reassurance I didn't realize I needed. Karen wasn't just losing the neighborhood, she was running out of ways to weaponize authority. The following day was the HOA meeting. It's held at the same community center as before. It was even more packed this time. The board wasted no time. Mr. Halverson stood up, read the proposal for Karen's removal from all HOA involvement, and opened the floor. One by one, neighbors stood and spoke, calmly, clearly, and with purpose. No yelling, no theatrics, just truth. Karen sat near the back, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they were nearly invisible. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close unanimous. Karen was officially barred from all committee roles and forbidden from distributing any notices. Under the HOA's name, afterward, some of us gathered in the parking lot, smiling, relieved, and finally feeling like the block could breathe again. But that night, as I walked Jasper in the backyard under the soft glow of the porch light, I heard rustling near the fence. I turned quickly, phone ready in hand, and saw a shadow moving between the hedges. My heart raced. I called out, "Who's there?" but no one answered. The next morning, Jasper's cage, though still locked, had clear handprints smudged across the outside. Someone had tried to open it. That was the moment I knew Karen wasn't just obsessed, she was dangerous. I reported the incident to the local police, sharing the video from the backyard camera, which showed a blurry figure moving toward the cage at 2:13 a.m. It wasn't clear enough to confirm it was Karen, but it was clear enough to show someone was trying to grab my bird. The officer said they'd increase patrols. I installed new floodlights and ordered an additional lock for the cage, one with a sensor that would alert my phone if tampered with. Jasper seemed anxious for the next few days. Less talkative, more jumpy. I did everything I could to reassure him, but I knew he felt the change. This wasn't over. Karen had lost her title, her authority, and her image, but she still had her obsession. And now that she had nothing left to lose, I feared she might just take things to the next level. The mood around the neighborhood had shifted, and not just in whispers and private conversations. Since Karen had been stripped of her HOA influence, people walked a little freer. Parents let their kids play closer to the sidewalks, and small acts of quiet rebellion began popping up like garden gnomes and hanging wind chimes that Karen used to rail against. But for me, things hadn't calmed down. After discovering the late-night smudges on Jasper's cage, I barely slept. Every creak outside set me on edge. I updated my security system, installed infrared cameras that covered every inch of my yard, and even got a motion-triggered spotlight that would sweep the backyard like a prison yard beam. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being prepared. I wasn't wrong. It was 3 nights later at exactly 3:04 a.m. when I got an alert on my phone. The live feed from the back camera showed a figure again, creeping along the hedge line. They crouched near the cage, but this time, when the sensor tripped the light, the person froze in the beam like a deer caught mid-crime. My camera captured everything. A woman, hood up, face half covered by a scarf, was clearly trying to break the latch on the cage door. Before I could even call the police, she bolted, sprinting out of frame, but not fast enough. The footage showed the distinct hemline of a blue fleece jacket that Karen was known to wear, along with her unmistakable gait, stiff, stompy, aggressive. This was no longer just an HOA issue or even a harassment case. This was trespassing, attempted theft. I called the local precinct and this time asked for Officer Bennett directly. When he arrived the next morning, I showed him the footage, the cage lock, the timestamps, reminded him about the prior report. He watched everything carefully and said the words I'd been hoping to hear. "We'll bring her in for questioning." I exhaled for the first time in days. Word must have spread quickly, because by that evening, 2 neighbors texted me saying a police car had pulled up in front of Karen's house, and she was seen talking to the officers for over 20 minutes. She didn't get arrested, but she didn't look happy either. The next day, a formal no-contact order was filed. She was legally prohibited from stepping foot on my property, tampering with anything I owned, or interacting with me or Jasper in any way. It felt like the wall between us had finally gone up, and I could breathe again. Jasper slowly returned to his usual self, mimicking doorbells and singing snatches of the Star-Spangled Banner. He even picked up a new phrase, "bad lady," which made me laugh every time. Despite the relief, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen wasn't finished. Even stripped of power, legally restrained, and exposed publicly, she had this way of lurking, waiting, biding her time. I kept my guard up, even as I resumed my normal routine morning walks with Jasper on my shoulder, chatting with neighbors again, and helping the HOA redraft their bylaws to prevent someone like Karen from ever grabbing that much influence again. I even helped launch a neighborhood animal awareness committee, something small but impactful to support pet owners who'd been harassed or targeted. It felt good to turn chaos into something helpful. The first event we held was a backyard pet parade, and I proudly registered Jasper as Grand Marshal. He wore a tiny red sash and whistled joyfully as we walked around the block, neighbors clapping, kids laughing. It was the kind of moment that reminded me why I loved living here, why I had fought so hard to stay. But of course, Karen made one last move. A few days after the parade, I received a certified envelope at my door. Inside was a legal-looking document and intent to sue. She had hired an attorney and was alleging emotional distress, defamation, and public shaming. I blinked at the pages, unable to believe what I was reading. She was claiming that my malicious campaign had ruined her reputation, damaged her mental health, and put her at risk of community ridicule. I knew enough about the law to know. This was a desperate move, something meant to scare me, not something she could win. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I contacted a local civil attorney who reviewed everything. After reading the full complaint, she leaned back in her chair and smirked. She doesn't have a leg to stand on. In fact, with all your documentation, we could countersue for harassment. That word stuck with me, harassment. It didn't seem big enough to cover what Karen had done, but it was a start. My lawyer prepared a response, and the next time Karen tried to contact anyone on the board or neighbors with copies of her lawsuit, she received a CSN desist warning backed by legal force. From that point, she began withdrawing fewer appearances on the street, less online activity, and eventually, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The day it went up, neighbors quietly celebrated. There were no loud cheers, no confetti, but you could feel the air lighten. She was finally leaving. Her house sat unsold for months, likely because of her reputation. But eventually, a nice couple with a rescue dog moved in. They introduced themselves to everyone with cookies and immediately joined the pet committee. Things had come full circle. Still, as I sat in the backyard weeks later, Jasper resting on my shoulder, I couldn't help but glance at the old property next door and reflect. One person had managed to hold an entire community hostage through fake authority, threats, and a need for control, but once the truth came out and people stood together, she lost all her power. Jasper chirped and said, "Bye-bye," in a cheerful tone. It was oddly appropriate. I reached up, scratched his head, and whispered, "That's right, buddy. Bye-bye indeed." The piece wasn't just about Karen being gone, it was about reclaiming our neighborhood, our sanity, and our right to live without fear of a net-wielding tyrant trying to snatch what we love. But before I could close that chapter completely, there was one last thing I needed to do. It would make sure Karen's name would never be used to bully anyone again. Once Karen was finally out of the neighborhood, the atmosphere became almost unrecognizable in the best way possible. For the first time in years, people were planning block parties without looking over their shoulders. Kids could ride bikes without being scolded for unsafe behavior, and Jasper's happy chatter filled the air without a single complaint. But even with the tension gone, the scars Karen had left behind were deep. A community that had once been silent under the weight of her threats had only found its voice through shared trauma. And I wasn't about to let that voice fade now that she was gone. So I proposed something radical to the new, energized HOA board. A neighborhood charter that would outline strict limits on what power HOA representatives could wield, require recorded meetings open to all residents, and install an ethics committee to oversee any future violations of authority. I was stunned when the board not only approved the draft, but expanded it with their own suggestions. We held an open vote. The turnout was the largest in HOA history. Over 90% of the homeowners participated, and the new charter passed unanimously. For the first time in decades, the HOA served the community, not the other way. Around, with Karen out of the picture, I found myself finally able to focus on the little joys that had gotten buried under all that stress-early morning walks with Jasper. Volunteering for the Pet Awareness Committee, even teaching Jasper new phrases just for fun, freedom. He liked to shout now, which made everyone chuckle when he said it during meetings. One day, while organizing old files, I found the original HOA handbook Karen had weaponized. With her handwritten notes in the margins, arrows, underlines, and words like loophole and enforce aggressively scribbled in red, I realized just how calculated her tactics had been, and it made me even more determined to share our story. So I reached out to a local podcast that focused on community justice and told them everything: Jasper's story, Karen's downfall, and how a neighborhood reclaimed its voice. The episode aired a month later, titled The Parrot That Ended, a reign of HOA terror, and quickly gained traction. People from across the country reached out to thank us for standing up and inspiring them to challenge their own Karen-like neighbors. Some even began referring to Jasper as the HOA whistleblower. It was funny and heartwarming, but more importantly, it reminded us that small actions, when taken collectively, could topple even the most deeply rooted tyranny. As for Karen, I later heard she'd moved to a condo in another county with strict board regulations, no pets allowed, which seemed fitting. There was some irony in her now living under rules she hadn't written herself. I couldn't help but wonder if she still carried that net around, hoping to control something. Back at home, Jasper perched on my shoulder one warm evening as the sun dipped behind the hills. Neighbors mingled on their porches, someone grilled steaks, and music floated gently through the air. "All good now," Jasper said, unprompted, and I nodded. "Yeah, it really is." We'd been through chaos, stress, fear, and frustration, but in the end, we stood up not just for ourselves, but for what was right. Jasper had become a symbol of that, a creature of color and sound in a world where someone once tried to silence both, and we made sure no one like Karen would ever try that again. If this story made you feel something, if you've ever faced someone trying to take control of your peace, your home, or your happiness, then don't stay silent. Stand up, speak out, and support the voices that get drowned out. And if you want to hear more unbelievable, dramatic, and true neighborhood stories just like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.